My name is Avery Lane, and I'm 29 years old. 2 weeks ago, I watched my famous mother erase me from her life in real time, with studio lights on her face, and millions of people watching her like she was a hero. It wasn't a rumor, it wasn't gossip. It wasn't a private rejection I could cry about in silence. It was a clean, polished sentence delivered on live television, the kind that gets clipped, reposted, and celebrated, while the person it destroys sits alone and tries to breathe. I had spent most of my life learning how to live in the shadow of her name. My mother, Serena Lane, wasn't just famous. She was the kind of famous that made strangers smile when they said her name, the kind of famous that got her invited to charity galas and award shows, the kind that made people assume she must be kind because she looked kind on camera. When I was younger, I used to believe that her fame meant she was untouchable in the best way, like a bright star that could guide me through anything. I also believed that no matter how complicated our relationship was behind closed doors, she would never deny me in public. That belief died on a Tuesday night in my apartment, the one bedroom I rented by myself because family had never been stable enough to count on. I'd come home late from work, exhausted, still wearing my blazer, still tasting stale coffee. The TV was on for background noise while I scrolled my phone, half listening. Then I heard her name. Serena Lane was being interviewed live on the Weston Hour, one of the biggest talk shows in the country. The host was smiling like he couldn't believe she was in the room. The audience clapped on cue. The camera framed her like royalty. I sat down without realizing it, like my body already knew something was coming. They talked about her new movie. They talked about her inspiring journey. They talked about her unbreakable strength. Then the host leaned forward and asked the question I'd heard in different forms my entire life. The question that always made my stomach tighten. He asked her what she sacrificed to become who she was. My mother didn't hesitate. She placed her hand lightly on her chest, like she was about to say something brave. She looked straight into the camera, and in that moment, she looked like the mother I used to imagine I had. Then she said it, calmly and smoothly, like it was the simplest truth in the world. She said she had no one to lean on. She said she built her life alone. She said she never had children because she refused to bring anyone into a world she couldn't control. And then she laughed softly, as if that choice made her admirable. I didn't blink. I didn't move. I just stared at the screen while my brain tried to correct what I heard, like it was a glitch in audio. Because I was her child. I had been her child my entire life. Not just legally. Not just technically. I had memories. I had photos. I had a birth certificate with her name on it. I had years of trying to be good enough for a woman who always acted like love was something you earned, not something you deserved. The audience applauded. The host nodded, like he'd just been handed a quote that would trend. My mother smiled wider. And I realized she wasn't protecting my privacy. She was erasing me. The shock didn't turn into tears right away. It turned into a cold kind of clarity. I picked up my phone and checked my messages, because I needed to prove to myself I wasn't crazy. Our last conversation was months old. I had sent her a text on the day of my promotion, short and hopeful, something I never sent to anyone else because I still wanted her approval. "Congratulations," she replied 6 hours later. No punctuation. No pride. No follow-up. Just a word that felt like it was typed by an assistant. I stared at her name in my contacts. Serena Lane. The name the world loved. The name I used to defend when people said she seemed distant. The name I carried like a fragile glass ornament, always terrified that one wrong move would shatter it. Then my phone buzzed again. Not her. A notification. A clip from the Weston Hour had already been posted. The caption was something like, "Serena Lane opens up about choosing freedom over motherhood." People in the comments were praising her, calling her brave, calling her honest, calling her a role model. I scrolled until my hands started shaking. I thought about the times she made me wait in a hotel lobby while she took meetings upstairs. The times she introduced me to people as her niece when cameras were around. The times she told me to keep my head down at events and not make things awkward. I told myself it was complicated. That fame made everything messy. That she would claim me when it mattered. But here it was. It mattered. And she chose the version of her life where I didn't exist. That night, I walked to the small safe I kept in my closet. It wasn't fancy. It was the kind of thing you buy when you've lived your whole life, feeling like the ground could disappear without warning. Inside, beneath my passport and a stack of emergency cash, was a plain manila envelope that had been delivered to me 3 days earlier. No return address, my name typed neatly on the front. It had come through a courier service. The kind my mother's world used when something needed to stay quiet. I hadn't opened it because part of me was afraid it was from her, and part of me was afraid it wasn't. I placed the envelope on my kitchen table and just looked at it, like it might bite me if I touched it. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried something more than documents, as if it carried a reason, a warning, a truth I wasn't ready to hold. I finally tore it open with the edge of a butter knife because my hands wouldn't cooperate. Inside was a single folded letter and a flash drive taped to the page. The letter wasn't from my mother. It was from someone who used to work for her. Someone who had been in every room where the real decisions were made. Someone who had disappeared from her life, just as suddenly as she had disappeared from mine. The first line made my throat tighten. It said that if Serena ever denied me publicly, I would need to know what she'd done to make sure I stayed silent. I read the next sentence twice, because it didn't feel possible. Then I heard my phone ring again, sharp and insistent, cutting through the silence like a siren. Unknown number. Los Angeles area code. The kind of number that usually meant PR teams, producers, or people who didn't call unless they wanted something. I stared at the screen until it stopped ringing, then it rang again immediately. I answered, because something in me knew my life was about to split into before and after. A professional voice introduced himself and told me he was a producer. He said the Weston Hour had received an anonymous tip about Serena Lane and a hidden part of her past. He said they were interested in hearing my side, live, on air, in front of the same audience that had just applauded my erasure. My mouth went dry as I looked at the flash drive on my table, because I suddenly understood what that envelope really was. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't closure. It was ammunition. I didn't know who sent the tip to the show, but as I stared at that flash drive, I realized the truth it held could destroy my mother's entire career, and the next time she looked into a live TV camera, she wouldn't be able to pretend I was nobody. The call didn't stop after the second ring. It came again and again, like whoever was on the other end knew I wouldn't be able to ignore it forever. I stood in my kitchen, phone vibrating against the counter, the unopened truth sitting between my hands. Just an hour earlier, I had been a woman watching her mother erase her on national television. Now I was being pulled into the same world that had decided I didn't exist. When I finally answered, I could tell immediately this wasn't a casual call. The voice on the line was calm, controlled, and trained to sound friendly without being personal. He told me he was a senior producer from the Weston Hour. He said my name like he'd practiced it. He said they'd received information suggesting my mother's public story wasn't complete. He said the show believed in transparency, in letting people speak for themselves. He said they wanted to offer me that chance. I didn't respond right away. My silence stretched, and I imagined him on the other end, waiting patiently, already knowing silence meant interest. I looked at the flash drive again, still taped to the letter, still unopened. I hadn't even processed what it might contain, and yet the world was already knocking on my door, asking me to confirm or deny a narrative I hadn't chosen. The producer continued, explaining that my mother would be appearing again the following week to promote another project. A live segment. No delay. No edits. Millions of viewers. He said if I wanted, they could bring me on remotely, or in studio. He said they would frame it respectfully, but I knew what live television really meant. Once words were spoken there, they couldn't be taken back. Once faces cracked there was no hiding behind publicists or carefully written statements. After the call ended, I sat on the floor with my back against the cabinet and tried to breathe. My chest felt tight, like my body was already reacting to a decision my mind hadn't made yet. I told myself this was insane. Normal people didn't expose their parents on live TV. Normal people handled things privately. Normal people didn't carry flash drives that could end careers. But then I remembered something important. Normal people weren't erased in front of millions. For years, I had protected my mother's image without realizing it. I avoided interviews. I stayed quiet when reporters asked about her personal life. I laughed off comments about how she seemed too independent to have a family. I did it because I thought loyalty meant silence. I thought love meant shrinking myself so someone else could shine. That night, sitting alone on my kitchen floor, I understood how wrong I had been. I finally opened the letter. It was short, direct, and written by someone who clearly knew what they were risking. The person explained they had worked closely with my mother during the years she was building her public persona. They said they had watched her reshape her life story, piece by piece, cutting out anything that didn't fit the brand she wanted to sell. They said my existence had always been a problem, not because I'd done anything wrong, but because I didn't align with the image of freedom and sacrifice she wanted to market. The letter didn't sound angry. That's what scared me the most. It sounded factual. It said the flash drive contained internal emails, contracts, and recorded meetings that proved my mother had deliberately instructed her team to deny my existence if asked. It said there were discussions about how a child would complicate her narrative and distract from her appeal. It said there was even a contingency plan in case I ever spoke publicly. I stopped reading and just stared at the wall. There it was. Proof that the erasure wasn't impulsive. It was planned. I thought about calling her, about confronting her privately, about asking her why. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew the truth. She wouldn't answer. And if she did, she'd deny everything. She'd cry on cue. She'd tell me I was misunderstanding. She'd ask me to think about her career, her reputation, her legacy. She'd make me feel guilty for wanting to exist. That's when I realized something shifted inside me. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about protecting her. I was thinking about protecting myself. The next day, my phone exploded. Messages from unknown numbers. Emails marked urgent. A voicemail from someone who claimed to represent my mother's team, saying they'd heard rumors and wanted to clear things up. No apology. No concern. Just damage control. I didn't respond. Instead, I took a day off work and locked myself in my apartment. I plugged the flash drive into my laptop and watched my entire childhood reframe itself in real time. I saw emails where my name was reduced to a liability. I saw notes about narrative consistency. I saw instructions about denying, deflecting, and reframing if questions ever came up. By the time I finished, my hands were steady. Fear hadn't disappeared, but it had changed shape. It wasn't paralyzing anymore. It was focused. That evening, the producer called again. He asked if I'd had time to think. He asked if I wanted to respond on air to what my mother had said. He said the segment was already trending, that the audience was curious, that people were asking questions. I walked to the mirror and looked at myself. Not the version of me my mother wanted hidden. The real one. The one who had survived being ignored, minimized, and quietly erased. I thought about what would happen if I stayed silent again. The story would settle without me. My mother would continue smiling into cameras. And I would become a rumor at best, a lie at worst. So I agreed. I told him I would come on the show. After the call ended, my apartment felt different. Quieter. Heavier. Like it knew something was coming. I packed a small bag without knowing why, as if part of me expected not to return the same person. I printed copies of the documents from the flash drive and slipped them into a folder. I practiced nothing. I didn't want a script. I wanted the truth. Late that night, a notification popped up on my phone. A post from my mother, a smiling photo from a red carpet. The caption talked about gratitude, honesty, and living authentically. Thousands of likes in minutes. I stared at it longer than I should have. Because in less than 48 hours, I would be sitting under studio lights, holding proof that her authenticity was carefully manufactured. And once I started speaking, there would be no way to stop what came next. What I didn't know yet was that my mother had already been warned about my appearance, and she was preparing one final move to silence me before the cameras went live. The studio felt colder than I expected, not physically, but emotionally, like the air itself had been conditioned to strip people down before the cameras even turned on. I arrived early, escorted through hallways lined with framed photos of celebrities who had once sat where I was about to sit. People who had cried, confessed, lied, and been forgiven on this very stage. I wondered how many of them had come in believing they could control the story, only to realize too late that live television doesn't belong to anyone. A production assistant clipped a microphone to my jacket and asked me to take a seat. My chair faced the stage, angled slightly toward where my mother would sit. I noticed the distance immediately. Close enough for tension. Far enough to feel like separation. Intentional. Everything about this place was intentional. As I waited, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was short and perfectly polite. It said this didn't have to happen. It said family matters should stay private. It said my mother was willing to acknowledge misunderstandings if I reconsidered appearing. There was no apology, no recognition of the pain she had caused, just an offer to manage the damage. I didn't reply. When the countdown began, my heart started beating so loudly, I was sure the microphone would pick it up. 5 minutes. Then 2. Then 30 seconds. The host's voice echoed from somewhere off stage, already warming up the audience with jokes and applause cues. I closed my eyes and reminded myself why I was here. Not for revenge. Not for attention. I was here because silence had cost me my identity. The lights came up. Applause filled the studio, sharp and controlled. The host introduced my mother first, listing her achievements, her awards, her influence. She walked out smiling, waving, perfectly composed. The audience loved her instantly. Of course they did. She had spent decades making sure they would. Then the host said my name. The applause was polite this time. Curious, confused. Cameras cut to my face, magnifying every expression. I could feel millions of people meeting me for the first time, deciding in seconds whether I looked believable, whether I looked like someone worth listening to. My mother didn't look at me right away. She kept her eyes on the host, nodding, relaxed, confident. When she finally turned, her smile faltered for half a second. Just enough for me to see it. The host started gently. He mentioned her earlier comments about not having children. He asked if she wanted to clarify anything, given that I was sitting right there. My mother laughed lightly, the way she always did when she wanted to seem unbothered. She said people often misunderstood her words. She said she valued privacy. She said she had always tried to protect those she loved from the pressure of fame. I waited. Then he turned to me. He asked how it felt to hear my mother talk about her life as if I didn't exist. The room went quiet. I felt the old instinct rise up in me, the one that told me to soften things, to protect her feelings, to make excuses. Instead, I told the truth. I said it felt like watching someone rewrite your entire life while you're still alive. I said it wasn't about privacy, because privacy is discussed, agreed upon, respected. This was erasure. My mother shifted in her seat. She responded quickly, saying she had always supported me, that any distance between us was mutual, that fame complicated things. She spoke smoothly, confidently, like someone who had rehearsed this version of events many times. I recognized it instantly. This was the version meant to survive public scrutiny. That's when I leaned forward. I told the host there was a reason I was there. I said I didn't come to debate feelings. I came with evidence. I reached into the folder on my lap and placed it on the table between us. The sound it made was small, but it felt thunderous in the silence. My mother froze. I explained that the documents came from someone who had worked closely with her for years. I said they showed internal communications instructing her team to deny my existence if asked. I said they outlined strategies to redirect interviews and reframe questions. I said this wasn't confusion. It was policy. The host asked my mother if she wanted to respond. She looked at me then, really looked at me, for the first time in years. Her eyes weren't angry. They were calculating. She said these documents were taken out of context. She said disgruntled employees often fabricated stories. She said this was a painful family matter, being exploited for ratings. And then she said something that changed everything. She said I was unstable. She said I had always struggled with resentment. She said I was doing this because I wanted attention. I felt the audience shift, sympathy pulling away from me, inch by inch. So I did the one thing she wasn't prepared for. I asked the host for permission to play the audio. There was a pause, a quick exchange with producers off camera. Then a nod. I pressed play. Her voice filled the studio. Calm, direct, discussing how acknowledging a child would complicate her narrative. Talking about how denial was cleaner. Talking about how she needed to be protected from emotional liabilities. No edits. No spin. Just her. The audience didn't clap this time. They didn't gasp. They went completely silent. The kind of silence that means something irreversible has just happened. My mother stared straight ahead, her face drained of color. She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time since I had known her, she didn't have the right words ready. The host thanked us both, and cut to commercial. As the lights dimmed, my mother finally turned to me and whispered something I couldn't hear, her lips tight with panic. A producer stepped between us, guiding her away. Another asked me to stay seated. That's when I noticed the security guard near the stage, watching me instead of her. And that's when I realized the show wasn't over yet. As the cameras prepared to come back from commercial, a producer leaned close and told me my mother had just made an accusation off-air, one that could turn the entire audience against me before the segment ended. When the producer whispered it to me, I didn't understand at first. My mind was still stuck on the sound of my mother's own voice echoing through the studio, stripped of filters and excuses. The accusation felt unreal, like something pulled from desperation rather than truth. But as I watched the controlled chaos unfolding behind the cameras, I knew she had chosen her final weapon. They told me she had claimed I was being paid to do this. Not just encouraged. Not influenced. Paid. She told them I had been promised money and publicity in exchange for attacking her on live television. She framed it as concern. As a mother worried about a troubled adult child being manipulated by media, she said she feared I was being used. She said she hoped the audience would understand how painful this was for her. It was a perfect lie. Clean, familiar, easy to digest. When the cameras came back on, I could feel the shift immediately. The audience wasn't silent anymore. They were restless. Murmurs floated through the room. The host's tone had changed too, softer toward her, more cautious toward me. This wasn't accidental. This was damage control happening in real time. He addressed the accusation carefully, saying there were claims about compensation and motivation that needed clarification. He asked me directly if I was being paid to appear. I answered honestly. I said no. I said I hadn't asked for this platform. I said I didn't come here to profit. I came here because my identity had been denied publicly, and I wanted the truth on record. But truth doesn't always land cleanly when doubt has already been planted. My mother nodded sympathetically, as if she were watching a sad story unfold. She said she was worried about my mental health. She said fame was hard, and not everyone could handle being close to it. She said she had tried to protect me from a world that chewed people up and spit them out. I almost laughed at how carefully she twisted the narrative. Almost. Instead, I grounded myself. I reminded myself that this was exactly how she had always operated. If I couldn't be erased quietly, she would discredit me loudly. If she couldn't deny my existence, she would deny my credibility. So I asked the host for a moment. I explained that I hadn't just brought evidence of erasure, I had brought evidence of motive. I opened the folder again and held up a printed email chain, dates visible, names redacted only where legally required. I explained that these emails discussed contingency plans in case I ever spoke out. Plans that included questioning my stability, my intentions, and my character. The audience leaned in. I said this accusation wasn't spontaneous. It was predicted, prepared. I said the irony was that by using it, she was proving exactly what I had come to show. My mother interrupted, saying this was harassment, saying she was being ambushed, saying she didn't feel safe. The word hung in the air, heavy and calculated. Safe. That word changed everything. Security shifted closer to the stage. The host raised his hands, trying to slow things down. Producers whispered urgently through headsets. The show was teetering on the edge of something they couldn't fully control. I could feel my heart pounding, but my voice stayed steady. I said I had nothing to gain by lying. I said if money was my goal, I could have stayed silent and written a book, sold interviews, chased headlines. Instead, I came here once, live, with proof, because this was where she erased me. Then I did something I hadn't planned. I addressed the audience directly. I told them I understood why the lie sounded believable. I said when someone famous smiles and someone unknown speaks up, people instinctively trust the familiar face. I said I didn't blame them for questioning me. I said I had questioned myself for years. That honesty shifted something. I could see it in the way people sat back, the way their expressions softened. Doubt didn't disappear, but certainty cracked. And cracks were enough. The host asked one final question. He asked my mother if she stood by her earlier statement that she never had children. The studio went still again. This was it. The moment she could step back, soften, acknowledge me, even slightly. She didn't. She said she stood by it. She said biology didn't make a family. She said choices did. And she said she had chosen a different life. It was cold, final, deliberate, and somehow, that was the moment I felt free. Because in denying me again, in front of everyone, she made something unmistakably clear. This wasn't confusion, this wasn't fear. This was a decision she was willing to repeat, no matter the cost. The host thanked us and announced the end of the segment. Applause followed, uncertain and uneven. As the lights dimmed, my mother stood quickly, refusing to look at me, already surrounded by her team. She moved fast, like someone trying to outrun consequences. I stayed seated. A producer approached me quietly and told me the network's legal team wanted copies of everything I had brought. Another told me social media was exploding. Another asked if I was okay. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what okay even meant anymore. As I gathered my things, I caught a glimpse of my mother near the exit. For the first time, her posture wasn't confident. Her shoulders were tight. Her steps rushed. The image she had built so carefully was cracking, and she knew it. But I also knew something else. What happened on air was only the beginning. As I walked out of the studio, my phone lit up with a notification that made my blood run cold. My mother had just released a public statement, and it accused me of something far worse than lying. The studio doors closed behind me with a sound that felt heavier than anything that had happened on air. No applause, no dramatic music. Just silence and the sudden awareness that whatever protection the cameras offered was gone. I stepped outside into the evening air, my phone vibrating nonstop in my hand, and understood that exposure doesn't end when the broadcast does. That's when it actually begins. I didn't look at my notifications right away. I couldn't. I needed a few seconds to remind myself who I was without the lights, without the audience, without my mother's shadow stretching across everything. I stood there, breathing slowly, replaying the moment she denied me again, this time with full awareness of what it meant. There was no confusion left. No hope she might change her mind later. She had chosen her story, even if it meant burning me out of it completely. When I finally checked my phone, it was chaos. Messages from friends I hadn't spoken to in years. Missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Screenshots of headlines already spreading. Clips from the show uploaded everywhere, slowed down, dissected, analyzed frame by frame. People arguing about me, about her, about truth, about loyalty. Some defending her. Some defending me. Strangers deciding who I was, in comment sections. And then I saw her statement. It was polished, released through her publicist less than 30 minutes after I walked off set. She called my appearance deeply hurtful. She claimed I had been manipulated by outside forces. She implied I had fabricated evidence out of resentment. She ended it by saying she hoped I would get the help I clearly needed. That part hurt more than I expected. Not because I believed her, but because I recognized the pattern. This was how she had always handled me. If she couldn't erase me quietly, she framed me as broken. It was easier for her world to accept that than to question the woman they admired. But something different happened this time. The documents didn't disappear. The audio didn't vanish. Former staff members started speaking anonymously. People who had worked around her for years began confirming what I'd shown. Patterns emerged. Old interviews resurfaced. Contradictions stacked up faster than her team could clean them. By the next morning, the conversation had shifted. It wasn't about whether I existed anymore. That question was settled. It was about why she worked so hard to make sure I didn't. I stayed offline that day. I let it burn without me feeding it. I needed to focus on something else. Something real. I went back to my apartment, the same small space where this all started, and sat on the floor with my back against the couch. For the first time, I cried without shame. Not because I'd lost her. I'd been losing her my whole life. I cried because I had finally stopped chasing her. Late that evening, someone knocked on my door. It wasn't the police. It wasn't a reporter. It was someone I didn't expect. Someone from my mother's past who had never spoken to me before. They didn't stay long. They didn't ask for anything. They just looked at me and said they were sorry. Sorry they hadn't said anything sooner. Sorry they watched me disappear and told themselves it wasn't their place. That apology mattered more than all the headlines combined. In the days that followed, the fallout spread quietly but relentlessly. Invitations disappeared from her calendar. Appearances were postponed. Brands paused partnerships. Nothing dramatic. Just distance. The kind that grows when trust starts to rot. She didn't collapse publicly. She didn't apologize. She simply faded from the center, the way people do when the illusion cracks but hasn't fully shattered yet. We haven't spoken since. I don't know if she ever will. And for the first time, that question doesn't control me. I learned something through all of this that took me nearly 30 years to understand. Being erased doesn't mean you were never there. It means someone else was afraid of what your existence revealed. My mother didn't erase me because I was inconvenient. She erased me because I didn't fit the lie she needed to survive. Exposing her didn't make me powerful. It made me honest. And honesty has a cost. I lost the fantasy of reconciliation. I lost the version of her I hoped might exist someday. But I gained something far more stable. My name. My story. My place in the world that no one else gets to edit. Now, when I look back at that moment under the studio lights, I don't see fear anymore. I see a line being drawn. On one side, a woman protecting an image. On the other, a daughter refusing to disappear. I don't know what happens to my mother next. I only know what happens to me. I move forward without shrinking, without apologizing for existing, without waiting for permission to be acknowledged. And no matter how many statements she releases, no matter how carefully she tries to rewrite her past, there's one thing she can never undo. The moment she erased me on live TV was the same moment the world finally saw the truth. What most people still don't know is that the evidence I revealed on air wasn't everything, and the last piece I've kept private could force her to admit what she's denied her entire life.